Just imagine the reaction if it was anyone besides Guillermo del Toro trying to make another Frankenstein movie. Hey everybody, welcome to Mainely Movies, and happy Halloween! As part of my coverage of TIFF50, the 2025 Toronto International Film Festival, today I'm going to be talking about the 2025 Gothic sci-fi film, Frankenstein, which is in select theaters now and will be released on Netflix on November 7th. If you're new here, please consider subscribing for a variety of movie-related content, like reviews, rank lists, and recommendations. All my reviews include a breakdown of the pros and cons, my rating, and even some tailored film recommendations, so be sure to watch through to the end of this video for all of that extra content. Frankenstein stars Oscar Isaac, Jacob Elordi, and Mia Goth, and was directed by Guillermo del Toro. Based on Mary Shelley's 1818 novel of the same name, it tells the story of an egotistical scientist, Victor Frankenstein, who creates life in a monstrous experiment with tragic consequences. It's funny how we're drawn to the classics. How, despite striving to make our own creative mark by making or seeking out something new, time and time again, we're pulled to the old, to what came before. This is not a new phenomenon, of course. Many of the films we revere as classics today are themselves adaptations of novels, many of which were in turn considered to be the classics of the day. I think most people are probably familiar with the old adage, write what you know. This advice can be applied to screenwriting as well, but when translated to film in general, make what you know often imperceptibly merges with make what you like. And what we like is so often influenced by what we're exposed to, especially at a young age. So it's only natural that people are drawn to the works that inspired them and had a hand in influencing their own personal style. For stories with many adaptations, it can be fun to think about what you would do with the material if you were able to make the next readaptation. What would you change? What would you keep the same? What aspects of yourself would you add to make it the best, the definitive version of the story? But very few people ever actually get that opportunity. And even fewer get that opportunity with a story that had shaped their filmmaking style and infiltrated their creative thoughts for decades. But that's exactly what Guillermo del Toro has finally experienced by bringing his version of Frankenstein to life. Frankenstein has been brewing within Guillermo del Toro for a very long time. He first publicly expressed his desire to make the project nearly 20 years ago, but you just know that ideas and even whole versions of the movie had been rolling around in his brain long before that. And it makes sense. Frankenstein is a story that feels perfectly suited to him. We most often associate him with fairy tale stories of dark magical realism, but sci-fi, monsters, and gothic horror have long seeped into his original work. And his choice of adaptations over the years have showcased his ability to put his own stylistic spin on existing work, to make something new and different. So the prospect of him getting to put his own mark on Frankenstein, a story already so in line with his own proclivities and stylistic sensibilities, was an exceptionally exciting one, especially for a big fan of his work. In general, readaptations of beloved film classics don't typically garner much support or excitement, but this was definitely an exception to the rule, and one that has understandably, and rightfully, generated a tremendous amount of anticipation. Frankenstein is a Guillermo del Toro film through and through. Surely, this is not a surprising thing for you to hear, considering this was a project that literally felt tailor-made for him. It's an interesting blend of his typical style, with pieces of a lot of familiar things, yet never wholly like any of his previous films, nor any previous adaptations of Frankenstein. This movie features far less magical realism than some of his fairy tale-inspired films, but still pulls in fantasy and a magical, heightened quality to the tragic horror of the story. The Gothic influences will no doubt draw comparisons to his 2015 film, Crimson Peak, but this takes a grungier, decidedly less ethereally moody approach. Nothing here feels dainty or fragile, and instead the Gothic opulence has a rich, heavy, muted feel to it, covered in a layer of off-putting, grimy filth, emanating more from the souls of man than from any decaying corpse. That said, if you are looking for corpses, this movie has certainly got its fair share of them. The film absolutely has that viscerality you'd expect from a Guillermo del Toro movie, featuring plenty of literal viscera. Perhaps expectedly, the creature's creation is quite gory, and far more graphic than most other film adaptations. This isn't just Frankenstein stitching together limbs from various corpses. He's actually designing his monstrous creation from the ground up, or maybe more accurately, the bone out. He's precisely laying out blood and lymphatic vessels, carefully connecting the overlapping complexities of the nervous system, completing a jigsaw puzzle of abdominal organs, while leaving the floor of his lab slippery with blood and leftover discarded body parts. The creature's creation is as gruesome as some of the destruction he later wreaks, and it's highly likely that more than one scene will have you grimacing in pain or disgust, or probably both at the same time. The makeup, the costumes, the production design, all of the technical crafting here is impeccable and exactly of the caliber you'd expect to see in a modern Del Toro movie. With his usual penchant for rich, darkly gothic visuals and romantically humanistic notions of monsters, Guillermo del Toro successfully puts his spin on a mostly faithful adaptation of the Frankenstein story. Frankenstein is a story that has become a staple in not only horror, but also more generally pop culture, having been adapted over and over again in countless forms. Mary Shelley's 1818 novel is a classic in its own right, and a favorite among horror literature fans, but its far-reaching influence is perhaps even more impressive, extending far beyond those who have actually read it, largely thanks to film. Frankenstein, and other similar, obviously Frankenstein-inspired stories, is so prevalent in film that it's likely that the average moviegoer has seen at least a dozen of them, maybe without even realizing it. But if I had to guess, I'd say that the version that pops into most people's minds at the mere mention of Frankenstein is Universal's 1931 cinematic monster classic, Frankenstein, starring the incomparable Boris Karloff as Frankenstein's monster. If you've seen that film, or any of the countless other adaptations and reimaginings, you'll already know the basic story of the arrogant scientist who wishes to conquer death and plays God by reanimating a piecemeal assembled corpse, which, of course, eventually ends in tragedy. That's the basic gist of things, and the 1931 film does a good job of consolidating the story. But anybody who's read the book can tell you that there's a lot more to the story, and that quite a few significant changes were made to the pieces that were kept, especially with regard to the monster. As I mentioned before, Guillermo del Toro's version of the story is actually a fairly faithful adaptation of the book, even though some elements, such as the Arctic expedition, may seem random or even a bit far-fetched if you haven't read the novel. Perhaps most notably, though, this adaptation retains the multi-perspective approach of the book. Unlike past film adaptations, which have merely observed the story's events from an external third-person perspective, the happenings of this movie are literally being recounted to us under the guise of the film's framing device, first by Victor Frankenstein and then by the creature. Although this storytelling approach is more in line with the novel's letter-writing framing device, not to mention the fact that it fits nicely into Del Toro's oft-used fairy tale narrative device, it does result in some noticeable and detrimental pacing issues. With its more comprehensive story, which includes the events that appeared in both the 1931 Frankenstein and its sequel, Bride of Frankenstein, plus more, Del Toro's version is already overstuffed and quite long. But by, possibly confusingly, jumping into the story near its icy end in order to set up its framing device, and then proceeding to dive into an extensive backstory for the extremely unsympathetic, unlikable, and often uninteresting Victor Frankenstein, things get off to a very slow start. There are certainly some periodic spurts of intrigue early on, especially as things ramp up with Frankenstein's discoveries and experiments, but the movie doesn't truly come alive until the creature does. And even then, the pacing still drags some until the perspective shift that accompanies the start of part 2 of the film. That shift reinvigorates what had by then become a sluggish, lurching movie, and the highly sympathetic creature's tale makes it surprisingly easy to re-engage with the story. Maybe because it feels new to filmgoers, maybe because the creature is more interesting and compelling than the one-note Dr. Frankenstein, or maybe it's simply because this is when the film finally truly enters Guillermo del Toro's wheelhouse. Whatever the case may be, it's a big improvement over the first half, and the film effectively transforms into something more emotional and profound during that second half. So is Frankenstein Guillermo del Toro's quintessential film, his all-encompassing magnum opus? From an audience member's perspective, probably not. But from his own personal filmmaking perspective, yeah, it might just be. This is the story he's wanted to tell, and the dream movie he's wanted to make for decades, and now he's done it precisely the way he wanted to. Alright, let's talk about the pros and cons. Pro number 1 is Guillermo del Toro's style. I realize that this is not a surprising pro, but it's definitely one of the film's shining aspects. Frankenstein is very much his type of story. We all knew it. He knew it, which is part of why this has been his dream project for decades. Everybody knew that this was right up his nightmare alley, and that he'd be stylistically swinging for the fences. And of course, he knocked it out of the park. It's a dark and richly gothic period piece that has an atmospheric weight to it. It's a little opulent, a little gross and off-putting, and just the right amount of weird for a corpse resurrection story. The craftsmanship of the film's technical elements is off the charts, as Del Toro successfully puts his own recognizable stylistic spin on this latest adaptation of Mary Shelley's famous story. The second pro has got to be the creature. I'll admit that this was one of the aspects that I was actually most concerned about, or at least skeptical of, coming into the movie. Like most people, the Frankenstein I grew up with was the 1931 Universal Monster classic featuring Boris Karloff's iconic performance as the monster. And that first trailer for Del Toro's adaptation made it clear that we were going to be getting something very different. A supercharged, but otherwise much more faithful to the novel rendition of the story. This could have easily been jarring, but between Jacob Elordi's performance and the film's second half perspective shift, the creature was just as sympathetic and compelling as ever, maybe even more so. On the con side, the biggest issue is the pacing. This movie is very slow to start, taking far too long to truly get going. The film's framing device and icy Arctic intro will be bizarre and possibly even confusing for those unfamiliar with the novel. And even once the storytelling framing device is established, the lengthy backstory and personal lead-up for Victor Frankenstein feels unnecessarily dragged out. The first half is, of course, periodically dotted with moments of disturbing experimental delight or unexpected instances of gore and brutality, but it's still all a bit of a drag. The movie doesn't truly come alive until the creature does, and even then, it takes until the Part 2 perspective shift for the film to become reinvigorated and engaging again. Before I give you my rating and recommendations, I want to remind you that if you're interested in buying Frankenstein or any of the other films I mentioned today, I do have affiliate links for all of them in the description below. I get a small commission from anything you buy using one of my links, so I'd really appreciate it if you use them if you're in the market for any of these movies or anything else. I'm gonna give Frankenstein 3.5 out of 5 paws. This is a Guillermo del Toro film through and through, with his usual penchant for rich, darkly gothic visuals and romantically humanistic notions of monsters. He puts his spin on a mostly faithful adaptation of the classic novel. It's a bit too long and is definitely slow to start, but it's full of heart in that melancholically dark yet magical and wondrous way that only Guillermo del Toro can pull off. I would recommend Frankenstein to anybody looking for a rich and darkly gruesome adaptation of a classic horror novel. Although telling the same basic story, this film is quite different from the 1931 Universal Monster movie that you may be most familiar with, instead sticking much closer to the novel. This may irritate big fans of that original movie, but I think those who like the book may actually prefer this cinematic version. And of course, anybody who likes Guillermo del Toro, and especially his more gothic horror-infused films, will find plenty to enjoy here, because it truly encapsulates all of the beloved and expected aspects of his filmmaking style. If you liked Frankenstein, I would recommend the 2024 version of Nosferatu. This Robert Eggers film is another recent adaptation of a classic horror novel that itself led to one of the most influential and highly regarded horror films of all time, with F.W. Murnau's 1922 Nosferatu. This is another dark period piece that incorporates plenty of changes, off-putting and gross yet richly gothic visuals, and impressive stylistic craftsmanship. If you'd prefer something a bit less intense, you might want to check out Edward Scissorhands. This modern reimagining of the Frankenstein story is weird and dark, but has an almost fairy tale storybook tilt to it that makes everything feel a little lighter, although it ultimately remains tragic and a bit off-putting in that strange Tim Burton kind of way. Like Frankenstein is for Guillermo del Toro, Edward Scissorhands is extremely representative of Burton's style, and instantly recognizable as his movie. And if you'd like another actual Frankenstein tale, you should watch Bride of Frankenstein. The 1931 original film might be the more obvious choice, but this 1935 sequel incorporates many of the elements from the novel, and later Del Toro's film, that were changed or left out of that first movie, including the monster's perspective and his life-changing and very moving bond with the old blind man. Alright, a couple questions for you guys. Number 1, have you seen Frankenstein? If so, what'd you think of it? And number 2, what's your favorite film readaptation of a story that already has a widely regarded classic or definitive movie version? Be sure to leave your answers in the comments below so we can get a discussion going. Alright, so if you got some enjoyment, insight, or information out of this review, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. And if you haven't done so already, please hit subscribe while you're at it to see more videos like this. Till next time, this has been Alyssa with Mainely Movies, the way life should be.